Hi guys, nice to see you again. And let's start topic by topic.
Well, we can start with the analytics stuff, and as Nikolai mentioned, or on the date time stuff. So I'll try to bring that up here. But I think that there's a few problems that we wanted to solve that are related in the date time space, but are perhaps distinct. So just kind of stepping through those. So essentially, I think that there are three distinct problems here. So one is I mean, essentially the goal of taking all the various sort of union or polymorphic date time types and normalizing those so they're easy to work with in the database. And so that kind of one breaks down to a pattern. I think originally that I think Dan, I heard first from Dan, which was basically extract out start and end times for all that. And I think what we see here, we've determined is not sufficient because we want to be able to get like the floor milliseconds and the ceiling milliseconds at all. So we'll touch on that in a second. And the other piece of information is we'd like to be able to basically give the database an explicit type hint. I guess in some cases, if we're getting like floor millis or ceiling millis, then that wouldn't be necessary because that will be the type there is well defined. At the same time, if we're just working with like well, for this isn't a great example, but if we're just working with a date, maybe we want to be able to tell the database, hey, when we see this birth date, we expect in our system that all the birth dates are actually dates and not years, and be able to use your first class date type. And so the result of all this is like when trying to come up with minimal improvements, minimal additions to the spec that is flexible enough for this variety of use cases, and hopefully for others as well. So this is kind of like a rough pattern as a starting point. It does not, what we see here does not yet address like the floor or ceiling millis. We can touch on that momentarily. But I think one pattern that made sense is like, I think there's another thread that proposed a union for related use cases, I think for unit conversions. So I think the fact that I found that useful if we want to do a union and look at like date time and period and be able to get the start and end time from each. I think that was a useful pattern. It's a little bit more verbose. We could probably come up with a shorthand for this, but I think there's the trade-off between brevity and keeping the spec small in that case. The other thing that I'd like to consider is a tagging mechanism, because I think this general desire had popped up in a couple other discussions as well, where we want to be able to sort of attach some sort of like system-specific metadata or system-specific behavior to columns. In this case, it's like a type in information, but I could see other cases where there might be some additional sort of database-specific or system-specific metadata we want to be able to attach with a field. And so just as like the simplest thing that could possibly work mentality, one approach would be to just have arbitrary tags, but we can consider alternatives in that space as well. So those are the two things. And then the third discussion that we'd have to click over to the Zulip for would be is to support like floor and ceiling milliseconds. Originally, I was thinking about doing that as tags as well, but I think Dan brought up a good point. It's like, well, if we're going to add additional, particularly if we're going to add like get ID or other things to FHIR path, then maybe we should just propose like a floor milliseconds and the ceiling milliseconds, or earliest or latest milliseconds or something like that as a FHIR path function as well, which I'm very sympathetic to. So yeah, in fact, I think if we do end up adding like having get ID or something like that, then it probably just makes sense to keep that as also add additional FHIR path functions, because we kind of cross that threshold of expanding FHIR path. So yeah, there's a whole lot there, some of which is on the screen, some of which is not. But yeah, I'll pause there for like, which area would this group like to jump into first of these multiple items, or I can go through them one by one and we can drill down a bit.
I think that the main new stuff is the union. So we kind of implicitly discussed it, yes, but so I think we should discuss that we are going to introduce the union keyword. So do we want to try the union, so then try to specify what I see that union will have the same problem like for each, because union on null, we need something like union on null as well. And there's a proposal for where statement inside union and for each as well, which may simplify like filtering for each and union.
Yeah, so I think like I don't want to conflate too many discussions because we'll get otherwise it'll be difficult to lose track. But I mean I'm supportive of adding this union proposal. Like I know there's a little bit more discussion on the Zulip in that space. I mean the fact that it was useful for this and other use cases suggests that it has enough value to justify the complexity. So I think union makes sense to add from that, and maybe we can spawn off of a separate thread to work out. I know that Nikolai, that there is some specific semantics we need to make sure are well defined in that. I'm tempted to maybe we can spawn off a separate thread to kind of define the union semantics and kind of focus on some of the state time stuff since we had started that now. But +1 for adding union.
Yeah, maybe then me or Josh, who is introduce this union, can work on proposal, like more formal proposal of union.
Sounds good to me, but I've talked a lot, so I'll let others weigh in.
Yeah, I think Nikolai, if you want to take a stab, that would be good. I haven't yet come across the use case where I needed a fallback in the union. I was just thinking about this as all the rows emitted by each of the parts of that array. But if you want to propose one that includes a fallback, it would be good just to include an example use case along with it as well, so that we can see where it fits.
So I will work on this proposal for the next meeting for the union, like in.
I think it makes sense to continue with the date time stuff. I want to just kind of put a pin in a discussion about adding about where as a keyword, because I was thinking about this a little bit, and I think if we have a where keyword, I think there's a question of whether we even need the where FHIR path, like whether we want to include .where in our FHIR path subset, because it's a little bit redundant and it kind of gives you two places to put the same thing. So it might be worth thinking through kind of the use cases where I have to be careful about words. The use cases where the where would be needed in FHIR path versus at kind of in the JSON structure.
Mm-hmm. There are some use cases. Yeah, sometimes we use where to filter the rows. Not in this case, but let's say in Josh union case, when you have molar glucose and milligram glucose, you're filtering the rows by specific.
Right, but if you have where at the JSON level, you could do that too.
Yeah, but sometimes you use a where when you're in an extracting expression, which in a column, and you potentially can kind of write it as a nested for each or something like this. Yes, but I think it's more short form when you use where in FHIR path expression, because you're not always doing for each, yes, for everywhere. Sometimes you like just getting like law in court or something like this, yeah, or patient name. So then shaping it as a nested for each, just too much to print. I don't know.
Okay, I'm open for that, but I think then we need some guidance on which where to use when. Josh points out in the chat that they could be semantic sugar, which I think is okay, but I guess from like the whole point of this is developer ergonomics, and so kind of understanding, like having two potential ways of writing every expression seems a little confusing to me.
Yeah, but I found the same for the union. If we introduce where, yeah, it really can be done on both sides. Yeah, but at least on top level, we think that we want to have a separate section. Yeah.
So like, do we say from shouldn't include where in the FHIR path and should have a where JSON structure? Or I guess like I'm not averse to having both, but then I think we should have a reason to use one versus the other. Yeah. Otherwise, I think
I would say if you use where for filtering, for readability, it's better to use it as a separate keyword. Okay, yeah, I got you. So
we should think it through.
Yeah, we should think about it.
Sorry, I didn't want to derail the time of discussion. I just wanted to mention that as a thing we have to work through.
Mm-hmm. As well, we have the same discussion about where to put this like upper boundary or sailing stuff in the FHIR path or in a separate instruction. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah. So we can jump into that. But yeah. So it sounds like there'll be a follow-up item on the where semantics, and maybe like we'll draft a couple of proposals and we'll come back to that. That's it. Yeah. So with regards to like the so I think I had a little more example here, but I mean, honestly, having gone through this and mulled Dan's feedback a little bit, it's like I am kind of shifting my perspective a little bit of if we're going to have get ID, then we should have like ceiling instant and ceiling instant and floor. Josh, I totally read your semantic sugar as syntactic sugar. I didn't even notice it, but anyway, so in this example there, the ceiling instant would become like a FHIR path function that would be attached to this there, which I think is kind of like in the spirit of what Dan was suggesting. I think I'm leaning in that direction here, especially if we had get ID. But I don't know. What are folks' opinions on that?
I think these are more general purpose FHIR path expressions, like finding the floor of a date. Particularly, I'm interested in whether they could work without having to do a bunch of types. Like if I just wanted to call the floor of observation.effective, can I do that and have it work across all, effective time, effective period, effective date time? I don't know, there's 3 or 4 different options there. And if I could just write that once, I think that would be useful in all kinds of FHIR path expressions, not just analytics on FHIR. At that level, I think it would make sense for those functions to live upstream, or for us to define them as FHIR path expressions so they could eventually live upstream.
There are some implications. I mean, I see what you're saying. It'd be nice just to be able to eliminate this unit if we just had like effective and then floor instant and then you didn't need this branching logic or anything. That seems like super concise and readable. That's definitely desirable in this case, because it'd basically be like a polymorphic floor instant function that would work across types. There might be I think it's going to be interesting to think about. Well, yeah, I'm sure it's doable. It's like I'm jumping into how do I translate that to SQL, and this sort of type hint of like getting this and translating that to SQL narrows it quite a bit. But I think that maybe there's like 2 distinct discussions here of like one adding floor instant as a FHIR path expression, and then separately, like if we can see if we can eliminate like this of type stuff, which I definitely get the appeal of, and hopefully we get there as well. But maybe it's a distinct thread.
Yeah, I agree. The 2 cases, and the first that we're trying to get like void SQL instant. Yes. So
yeah. So I mean, I think specifically, there's the FHIR instant type, which I think, as I recall, like requires like the fully specified, or the FHIR paths instant type that requires the fully specified, daytime, time zone, and everything there. And I think that is sufficient enough that it maps cleanly to database types, because it's a full time zone qualified date type field, datetime field. Unlike the other, unlike just date or date time, which can be variable granularity. Yeah, so I guess the TL essentially, if you have floor instant, we might not need additional type information for the database because it's implied.
And do you think that kind of the keyword like datetime transform shouldn't be like generic, just transform, and so we can plug other functions if we are talking about like separate? So we can plug more function, not only for daytime, but for the other stuff as well.
Yeah, well, I think if we so what we hear is like just something I wrote up. I think that what we might go with is we might actually drop this tag entirely. We might use. I think tags are important, or something like tags are important for other use cases. But in this case, we would just rewrite this. Well, if I had an editor, actually, maybe yeah. So I think that in this case, what would probably look like a time like. Yes, so select date types. So if we kept it in this model, it might be look like this dot floor instant, and then you wouldn't need the tag there. And if we did ultimately like what Josh was suggesting of getting rid of untype, we could just have a floor instant on the effective directly,
or maybe with a different name. But because I think we probably need both of functions. Yes, if you have like FHIR daytime and want to get like a floor or ceiling of it, and the polymorphic function. I could not decide should they be named the same way. Josh, you suggest like say effective dot flooring instant.
Well, my example was for observation. If I wanted to pull the earliest time out of the observation dot effective element, that's polymorphic element, right? It could be effective period or effective date time and so on. Want to understand whether it would be possible to call this floor function on the polymorphic element rather than having to specify one of its forms.
Right. And so I think that if I were to like do this really quickly in there, so maybe that might look like is just at the top level, we have just, assuming we're under observation, so we have effective. So basically we just have, actually the expression is just, now I've mangled it. And so that way you don't need to have like you don't even need like the union stuff here, because you have this polymorphic function that runs on top of whatever the polymorphic type is. It just gets the floor instant and ceiling instance, whether it's a period or a date or a date time or anything like that. So it's just like super concise, right? This is like the shortest way that we could express this. Oops, that should be ceiling instance.
Yeah, I like this. And what about timing? Should we try to explore the timing date type? Or at least define the semantic for timing.
To be honest with you, I've used the timing type. So actually, I've never actually really used the timing type. So I don't really recall the semantics of that.
Yeah, but that looks quite nice. And I think it can be pushed to the FHIR pass upstream.
So I had a comment on the tags. Do you think the tags should be more declarative and declare like it looks like you're naming a function or something, where before I think you had it declare more of a data type.
Or the way things are going is like we can almost like what I have highlighted here. I'm tempted to just delete it because we'll probably drop these tags. And so I think that's basically what this comes down to, is like based on this conversation and having mulled it over yesterday as well. I think that we need to come back to this and have like a cleaner proposal here, because this is noise now. It doesn't seem like we're going to do quite what I had written up here. But so maybe like better examples or tags, like if we wanted tags that are more declarative, like, hey, this is for Postgres, it's like a timestamp or something like that. But that's not, but we're conflating too many topics and we have like an incomplete in working example. So I'm afraid if we go into too much depth right now, we'll just end up confusing ourselves. And so it might be best if I'd be happy to kind of take this offline, update this proposal to move to these distinct functions, and two, have more clear examples of tags that are declarative, like you said there, because I think we're creating confusion now by having like this evolving incomplete inconsistent example during the conversation.
Sorry, I have a little bit of higher level question. So when you are, it seems that here we are, and sorry, I have missed many of these meetings, so maybe this has been discussed before. So when we are, it seems we are adding things to FHIR path. And then is it in general okay? Meaning that what I mean is that, there are like, FHIR path evaluators. Then if we are changing like FHIR path, then we are like, those evaluators needs to implement those functions, versus the other approach is that, we just stick with whatever is in FHIR path, and then the extra things that we need to add, we just add to this spec.
So FHIR path as a base language includes a certain number of core functions. And then it's also extensible. So the FHIR path spec itself is maintained separately from FHIR. And then FHIR adds a whole bunch of functions to FHIR path. So we would be doing something analogous. We would be saying, to use FHIR path in the analytics context, here's 5 extra functions that you would need to implement.
So as well, most of people keeping in mind implementation when the FHIR path transpiled to SQL. So they are going to implement it, and they kind of understand that so it's going to be kind of fresh implementation. So we see like 2 main direction how to implement SQL on FHIR, through existing like processing data in the stream and using existing FHIR path engines, like batching stuff, or transpiling this view definition into the one SQL query. And I think most of people keeping in mind this implementation, and Josh provided the simple implementation with JavaScript, which just use existing FHIR path library.
Yeah, I was exactly thinking about the scenario that, you have like a general, like a CDC or something that, it gets resources like FHIR resources, applies the FHIR path on the resource, and then just emit some rows, and then write them into the database. But yeah, it doesn't necessarily need to be transpiled into SQL in that case.
Yeah. We keep in mind both implementation styles. Maybe we can be more aggressive in interacting with a FHIR path group, and at least if you introduce something, try to push it to the FHIR path specification, I don't know, FHIR or base.
Yeah, I put a note in this conversation thread that Ryan has open, just mentioning that I tried to do just that, Nikolai. I brought at least these floor and ceiling functions into the FHIR path discussion on Zulip to see if there's other folks who are interested. And my guess is a lot of what we're talking about here will turn out to be useful to the broader community.
Yeah, so that's great. And to be honest, like I wasn't aware like quite the relationship of how the additional functions added to the core FHIR path functions. So now that I understand that a bit better, then actually I think that just adds more justification to making these things first class functions. So I'm tempted to just kind of like conclude as a working decision. Yeah, we'll make these, like we'll make floor instant and ceiling instant like first class function. I'll update this proposal. Floor instance and ceiling instant will become first class functions, and we can pursue these sort of upstream threads there. And you know, if the FHIR path community doesn't go for it, then we still have precedent from FHIR in adding additional functions, which I think gives a good justification there as well.
One last quick comment. Does FHIR path have coercion? Could we do something like floor dot to instant instead of making a higher level floor instant function?
But how we say that it's going to be upper bound or lower bound?
You'd have floor paren dot to instant or something. I'm just wondering, then you'd have a floor and a ceiling function and you could coerce it. Or do we want to have a combined function, floor instant, ceiling instant?
At least if you want like polymorphic function, it probably should be like floor instant because it's a very specific, not just flooring or ceiling. I've seen in FHIR path some like lower boundary and upper boundary, but it is not applicable for the dates. Yes, it is for numbers. Or
I guess, are there other data types where we'd want floor and ceiling? Or is it always instant?
yeah, maybe a date could be. I can imagine if the resulting type is a date, you may floor to date. If in FHIR data there is a year, so they maybe you want to floor to date.
Yeah.
But are you asking about non-temporal types where the concept of truncation applies?
Yeah, is floor or ceiling useful? And then I'm just, and maybe this doesn't go anywhere, or maybe I'm confused, but I was just thinking, are there useful cases in FHIR path where you just want floor and ceiling, and then follow on, is there coercion where you could get the floor and then cast it as an instant or a date or whatever, or a date time?
I think it's tricky because the core FHIR path spec does already define this function, which is a integer valued function. So it doesn't really leave room for that level of abstraction.
Oh, I gotcha.
Yeah.
I see.
And if you call floor on a date time in FHIR path, it would probably be an error of some sort right now.
Yeah, that's not explicitly stated, but that seems to be the case.
Amend floor so that if it operates on anything temporal, it's always an instant type. That would be confusing, I guess. It's better to have a function that intentionally reveals floor instant.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's my inclination. I mean, this seems more clear, like what you're getting from this function when I see floor instant. And I think Nikolai's point, we could consider, I don't know if it's necessary or not, but I could see an argument for floor date as well if you're working with like date types and you just want, you know, the start date and end date. Like, yeah, I mean, I can see a lot of like database usages where, you know, if we're looking at like, you know, encounter starter end dates or for episodes of Carol. I mean, there's a bunch of things where knowing a date range is convenient from a database perspective as opposed to drilling down to the types.
Can be floored to instant and then casted to date, something like this.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Like you could always have a tag, use your tag to do the casting, or do it in a, like once you have the instant, it's very easy to do in a database. Whereas creating an instant out of like a year and month is more involved. So if we're gonna kind of encompass, you know, kind of package some logic, like I would argue for just doing the complicated thing and then kind of letting either doing it by casting or doing it in as part of your subsequent query.
Yeah. Okay. I think that sounds good. And I like the keeping additions to the spec minimal. So it seems like the minimal reasonable thing is floor instant and ceiling instant. And sounds good.
And I'm a little bit scared about time zones and UTC. So do we consider it everything in UTC, like, or?
Yeah, that's not a topic I had touched on yet. So I mean, I know like a lot of days, or most databases will have like the native like date time, or they have time zone like date times that are qualified by time zone. So we attach to that. But yeah, I think the time zone exploration is a topic we need to further explore as well.
Yeah, because sometimes you may need UTC, like kind of generalized time, but sometimes you won't just work in the time zone if it's like time of the visit or something like this, and you want to determine morning or evening or something like this.
Yeah.
Couldn't we specify that floor instant and ceiling instant return the time zone?
If specified, yeah. If the date has a time zone, it should be preserved.
Right, like if you just have a year that you're converting to an instant, there isn't a time zone associated with that type. So you'd be
Right.
right. You have to, like, you could maybe pass in a time zone, or we could just do everything as UTC. But like,
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah.
Well, if you're converting up to just a date specified in a year, and you're trying to upscale that to an instant, you have to be prescriptive about which time zone you mean. So that would need to be a parameter.
Yeah.
That can be included. Or we can say it's an optional parameter, and in absence of one, it defaults to UTC, which I think is quite reasonable.
Okay.
The only comment-
Yeah, I think there's a few options there. I mean, I'd be tempted even to have like maybe it's like some sort of like either on the runner or in the view, like the default time zone for like, because the yes, I'm converting to dates, you know, chances are it's like, yeah, there's a default time zone and you can override that. But,
Yeah, it's a good point. It could be configurable in the tooling as well. My only comment about doing any kind of transforms like this is that we have to ensure that if they are stated, then we have to have a mechanism for people who are defining these to declare that they're required. Because fundamentally, if you're doing a floor on anything, you're doing some type of data erasure. And when I think about how I would use this, I'm going to be creating something that I might apply as a standard to every health plan in the United States. And if some of them have a database platform that does support flooring, and so they do it, and others don't, so they don't, we lose a degree of apples to apples at that point, because then some people might be getting passes simply because they chose the right database platform, where other people are getting failures because milliseconds count. Now, I don't think any of our actual measures care about milliseconds, but when it comes to things like truncating from a year to a day or something like that, and in quality measurement, we get really picky about something like, you can't, if you have a birth date and it's 2023, you can't pick a date and call it January 1st. You're not allowed to do that. You have to stick with the fact that it's 2023. So we just need to make sure that the standard can be very explicit about what you know, it's kind of like the whole should, shall, must type thing. Like, if I say I'm flooring something, is that a must? Is that a shall? Should? You know, that's where my brain is going on this. That's all.
Yeah, and I think that the kind of the goal of this pattern is to make sure we try to capture that. I mean, so I think I just about any time you see a date floored, I'd expect to see a date ceiling. So it captures that nuance that, yes, it really means any time in 2023, not just January 1st, 2023. And I think that, and that's, I think one of the nice things about this pattern is that it puts everything in a normalized form. So whether if I say April 2nd, 2023, I have that floor and ceiling. If I say, you know, April 2023, I have that floor and ceiling. If I have, say, 2023, I have that floor and ceiling, and it matches the semantics.
Yeah, it's just a matter of to what degree is the tooling allowed to ignore that, right? That's what I'm thinking. Can we make sure that there's a way to kind of indicate that? I don't know whether that's a tooling concern, whether this is a spec concern. It's probably a tooling issue. You know, like, this is an error if you try to do this on a database platform that can't do for it. I don't think there's any that can't, but this is just one small example of a broader kind of concern. As we're thinking about FHIR path transforms, we have to keep in mind that we may need to say that you must support this, and if you don't, you can't use this, right?
So, Evan, are you saying, like, if there's a view definition that's just not applicable to a certain database engine because of some functionality?
Yeah, that's where my brain is going.
I just discovered that things even worse. If you're talking about period, so that start and end is a daytime, which can be partial, yes.
Yeah.
So you could not just take like start. You probably should take like start and flooring it or end and sailing it. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, precision generally is a one-way street. If you have something more precise, you can make it less precise, but not necessarily the other way around. You can't expand.
Oh,
Given a
I see.
date, you can't infer that what the day is or the month is. You can't embed that data. You're not allowed usually.
I see what you're saying, Nikolai. So if it's a period, you need actually two sets of floor ceiling.
Not
Right.
Not two. You will take like the flooring start, yes, and sailing end date.
Oh, right.
Because it can be partial. Yeah, you should be careful about this.
I think the semantics are fairly tricky here, and I think we want to be precise in that. I mean, I would expect, like, I mean, if we do add floor instant and you know, the whatever database engine or runner can't support it, yeah, I would consider that an error. And I think we need to maybe be explicit about that. I mean, you can't just, I mean, if implementations of this are just ignoring parts of the spec or have different semantics, then that's just going to be a minefield of error of issues. So yeah, I agree that we need to be crisp in the behavior there and what's required and with clear semantics.
And even if you
Yeah.
can bring us some use case where this data precision is important, like so that whether some bad things may happen if you don't play the right. So that would be nice to keep in mind the good use case, yes,
Yeah.
with all these daytime calculations.
Yeah, so I think that maybe so I think we had some other topics and yeah, and we're running a little out of time, so maybe I can yeah, I think it'd be good. It's like I can update this and we can maybe, I'd like to stress test it against a bunch of examples. I mean, so like I've been just posted an example of start of 2023 and end of, you know, another time, and like what exactly are, I mean, it'd be great to go through and like let's enumerate all these cases and make sure that the semantics match what we would expect.
And you can draw on some prior art because I know the CQL group has spent a lot of time thinking about this stuff because it's paramount when you're trying to do math on this and you're trying to say, is the start before the end? In the example I just gave, the answer is uncertain, right? So, you know, those are the types of things when you're doing transformation of data, how much uncertainty do you allow? Do you allow promotion of a date to an instant? Is that even allowed at all? Or is that null? Right? In the CQL world, it would be. And can I say that? Is there a way for me to, with tooling or otherwise, say that I don't allow that type of promotion? So therefore, when it happens, populate that column with null. So it's uncertain.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I think you got it, Dan. Go ahead.
I think we were going to say the same thing, which is basically like Ryan and I have also been having this discussion on Zulip a little bit, which is whether or not to include like an explicit original precision, either by whether it exposes original precision by a function explicitly, where you could say like here, the original precision for the start would be, you know, year, and the original precision for the date would be instant, or for the end would be instant. And so if you had those in, yeah, so then in your query, you could say, for this particular query, I only want to use the date if it's better, if it's, you know, at least up to the day level and not just a year, you know. So I think what the discussion we were having was whether we want to include that as a primitive function, or whether we want, or not primitive, a FHIR path function, or whether we want to just give you the ability to put these dates in your in your query output as a string, and then kind of let you reparse it or, you know, requery
that
as
would do
part
it.
of your query.
That would solve that problem, because then I can say, all right, this was originally a year, we promoted to an instant because, and I can just take the year from that and that'll be enough.
Yeah.
But to Nikolai's point, if there's any kind of weird, screwy time zone things that might happen, the year could be wrong. If you floor something in one time zone and it gets, you got to be really careful with the way, you know, that actually executes at tooling time. But that's, you know, that's a downstream problem you can think about.
Yeah, I think as we specify this, we should be explicit about that sort of stuff. And also, I was going to point out, and maybe this is a second stage, but once we have some of these examples, it'd be good also to think a little bit about like what SQL for them could look like, SQL for them could look like. Because if there's not a good way to translate into SQL, then we might have to also kind of rethink what we're letting people specify and whether that needs to be pushed to a different, to an ETL layer rather than a query layer or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, we don't want to invent things that require tons of like functional polyfilling to make it work. That would be not ideal.
From other side, if we're pushing this to this complexity to the user, that would be not so good as well.
Yeah, and I think part of this is trying to like find that right balance and then stress testing it both against use cases and user perspectives and implementability. So so I think it's kind of an exploration in this space. So I think we've made some good progress on the exploration, and we'll make the next one, and we'll maybe obviously we should pick this up again next week, and I'll update all this to, I think, hopefully to reflect the comments here. We can start stress testing that as well.
So the discussion that I had in Dev Days with some of you, I think Dan and Evan and maybe Nikolai as well, is to do, so when we do bulk export, so right now is NDJSON is the only format that I guess is in the spec. And then I think there was some discussion that maybe Parquet can be something that we can add into the spec, which was exciting to hear. So that's the context of the discussion. I think that's a very, very useful thing if that can be done for analytics purposes. But then, so I wanted to gauge interest in this group, whether this makes sense or not. Why this is related to this group and the discussion that we have here, because if we want to do Parquet, then we need a schema. I guess it doesn't make much sense to have JSON in Parquet. So and then having some sort of like a relational schema, then well, obviously what we are doing in SQL on FHIR v2 is defining like a schema out of FHIR resources. But if we want to have it in bulk export, then we need a standard schema. And my proposal is to use SQL on FHIR v1 for that.
Yeah, well, we had this discussion, and that's we get to the idea that Parquet is a good candidate for bulk export. And we clearly understand that we need schema for that one. But to have a schema, we need to understand what we call storage format. Yes, how we're going to store. Are we going to parse references or not? Something like this, or just dump it as is. And we understand the limitation of Parquet. Yes, so with all this, so we should stop recursion at some level. Yes, and we discussed that it would be nice to recommend some schema by the V1 or V2 SQL on FHIR, and probably see what will happen, because
so
we can contribute to that. That would be very nice, because if we will share the schema which is kind of recommended to use for the bulk export, so then even I think some tooling can be written which can transform like NDJSON to Parquet. Yes, like even if the original server export NDJSON, so using some tooling you can transpile it, transform it to the Parquet. And it would be nice to have one recommended schema, but then we have to decide on the storage format. What transformation do we apply on it? Yes, it could be V1 or something like V1. Yes, as we started discussion of naming, like for IDs and references and stuff like this.
So the reason I suggest, I guess, I mean, if I understand correctly, everything in V2 is about customization. Like is about, how do I define a view? And there are millions of ways of defining a view out of a resource. If we can agree on some flat views, and make it the standard schema, that's even better in my opinion. But I think it's very hard to come up with some flat views that we can put it for the bulk export, saying that if you are doing bulk export, then you do this flat view, then it becomes very opinionated. But I think if we can have a almost lossless transformation, that basically it's a mechanical way of going from FHIR resource definition to a relational model, to a relational schema, which is almost lossless, then we can say do this, and then on top of that you can apply any type of V2 schema as well if you want. But that would be the standard that goes into the bulk export.
Yeah, I agree, but I don't think it is going to be standard at the first. It can be recommended schema, and we can try to recommend. We discussed because for V2 we split into several layers. The first layer is a storage layer, and essentially schema belongs to this what we call layer 0 or storage layer. So now we're working on this like view layer because it looks like the quick win if we can define it, and but we can work as well on another track on this level 0 on Parquet schema. And yeah, it would be nice if you can contribute. If, for example, bring the first proposal for the schema, we can discuss it. It's definitely going to be based on V1 stuff, but maybe with some renamings.
So obviously Ryan started Bunsen when he was in Cerner, but then we kind of inherited that for our work. And that can become, I mean, we can put more effort behind it and then make it like a library that people can just get from Maven, for example, and then we have formal releases for it, which does exactly what Nikolai, you said, that gets FHIR resources and then gives SQL on FHIR V1 like records, basically. And then that
I would suggest maybe to discuss some decision which were done, yes, like how we're parsing references and other stuff, because on our like V2 level 0, we kind of a little bit we did less transformation. At least we discussed less potential transformation to be lossless. Yes, maybe just parsing references and that's all. Yes, and we discussed probably doing something with daytimes and stop on it. Yes, so maybe we can you can bring the first what you have now in Bunsen, yes, or what's happened after that, and we can discuss, and maybe with some slight changes, yes, we can agree on the Parquet schema, and then if we will have like open source tooling for that, that would be amazing.
Yeah, I agree that the what we have in the V1 spec is yeah, there's certainly some set of updates that are due there if we want to try and have a common pattern for that. I also agree, like starting with like a sort of a recommended like Parquet schema, and that we can kind of gravitate and experiment with, and then if that gets really solid, maybe we can consider pushing that forward more as a standard. But I think like a common, I mean honestly, if we get like a good solid common recommendation and good open source tooling, I think that Parquet schema may de facto become a standard for that particular use case. But yeah, I think building on V1 with some set of improvements seems like the right approach to me as well. And I'll drop a link into the chat here. It's like I know like in the draft spec, it's like we had yeah, so it's kind of like described this as the annotation layer, and there's a few ideas in there for things that we might for improvements to that. So, but yeah, this seems like the right approach, and I think this is also the right forum. And to Nikolai's point, we just had been focusing on that view layer a bit more.
Unless someone has something else kind of short and urgent to bring up, I wanted to just kind of poll people on the Connect-a-thon. So I got an email that I think the track deadline was this week. So if we want to kind of create a placeholder for a SQL on FHIR track, I'm happy to submit a page. I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to go yet, but I was curious if other folks are planning to go.
Yeah, I'm planning to be there. So yeah, let's submit, yes, and I hope to see you, most of you there.
Okay, just curious other people.
This is Phoenix in September, is that right?
Yeah, something like this. Yeah,
I think it's early September, right?
Yeah, and we probably can try to build like first draft, yes, because I think we have enough to try to shape it into something. And Ryan did a lot of work, so we can like.
Yeah, I can probably. I think I can make it. Yeah, so yeah, I'd love to meet up. I felt like the New Orleans was quite productive. Okay, we're like 3 minutes left. Are there any other last things we wanted to jump in?
Yeah, I can just report that I supported like union implementation in my demo, so people can go and play. And I think the Josh example with the translation of molar mass glucose started working. So if you want to break it and report me something, you're welcome. And I created discussion to standardize this get ID, yes, with the optional argument of resource type, and probably additional function to get the resource type of the reference. I call it like get resource type, but maybe other naming.
I think that the approach sounds good to me, but we can follow up on that discussion.
Timing obviously depends on people's schedules, but it sounds like we have a couple proposals that we want to write up and maybe review in subsequent meetings, if that works for everyone.
Next meeting, yeah, I will work on this union proposal.
Sounds good, and I'll update what we have in the date time stuff to adopt the sort of the function approach, and we'll see how far we can get in terms of like any sort of time zone semantics, and then maybe hopefully we get something clear enough that we can start sort of stress testing it against, like, what happens if you get under these circumstances, to make sure that we have clear and non-surprising behavior for all this stuff, because that's important.
Okay, thank you guys. Have a good day.
Cool. Thanks everyone.